The Hürtgen forest in January 1945 was no battlefield, it was purgatory. White froze every shadow, every tree, every body lying too still. American soldiers, scattered like lost ghosts, prayed inside foxholes dug into bitter permafrost. No sound, no movement, only the howling silence left after the German artillery finished tearing apart every radio, every hope of rescue. Sergeant Billy Hartman clung to a ritual, watch the forest, count his breath. In the midst of carnage, order meant survival. But nothing could organize what had happened. 4 American companies vanished from the radio network in minutes. 800 men cut off, each group fighting for its own survival. Alpha Bravo Charlie Dog. 800 heartbeats and not one could call for help. Hartman, Baker Company signalman, surveyed the scene shivering beneath battered canvas, fingers bloody inside shredded gloves. His breath fogged the deathly still air. The battered SCR-300 radio, his lifeline, lay silent, dead. Both antennas were shredded in the barrage, torn apart by German artillery with a cold surgeon's precision. Even a replacement would be useless. No coordinates, no artillery support, no evacuation for the wounded. Regulation demanded patience. Wait for engineers. Wait for supply. Wait for battalion command. But Hartman couldn't wait. The engineers were 6 miles behind, impossibly far. The enemy was closing in now, probing the line, whispering through trees, preparing a final assault. Waiting meant dying. Hartman's only hope? Improvise. He reached for the enemy, literally. A strand of German telephone wire, scavenged from the ruins. Vermicht standard field cable, 22 gauge, cracked rubber insulation. Not designed for radios. Manual said it couldn't work, period. Billy channeled memory instead of protocol. His grandfather's violin shop in Nebraska. Strings tuned by hand, by ear, not by textbook. Tension, resonance, vibration. The physics of survival. While others played in the dust, young Billy learned in sawdust. When you cannot buy solution, you build solution. The old man's words echoed in the silent foxhole. Corporal Danny Chin, Billy's only ally, crawled in with coffee. Antenna's dead. We're off the net, Billy confirmed. Chin glanced at the strange wire and shook his head. You're not actually thinking of using that? Billy drew out his battered notebook, equations and sketches filling every page, a diagram of violin strings, weird ratios, resonance curves. Logic said no, but desperation whispered yes. It probably won't work, Billy admitted. But I have to try. Out there, 800 men are fighting blind. Outside, German squads drifted closer, using runners and field telephones to coordinate. Their lines were alive, while the Americans had gone silent. Alpha pinned near Hill 493, Bravo couldn't evacuate wounded, Charlie couldn't protect ammo, Dog was so far forward they might as well be in Berlin. Billy was about to violate every protocol, ignore every warning, risk court-martial and catastrophe. 12 hours to reconnect the battalion or all hope shattered. He rewound the lessons from Kearney, Nebraska. Grandpa Joseph's broken English, wire is physics. Too tight breaks, too loose fails. Must find balance. Billy planned tension, length, wire gauge with frozen hands and a pounding heart. Captain Morrison, the by-the-book commander, arrived with engineers. They saw the German wire and frowned. Sergeant Hartman, what are you planning with enemy cable? Morrison demanded. Billy faced them. Restoring radio contact. I'll build a field antenna with this wire. Lieutenant Parker, the skeptical engineer, scoffed. Telephone wire has the wrong properties. Impedance, gauge, everything. It won't transmit. You'll blow the radio. Morrison hesitated. You have 12 hours, Sergeant. If you don't succeed, we wait for replacements. Fail, and you're court-martialed. Tension built. Billy understood the risks. If it failed, he'd carry the blame. But sometimes protocols kill more than they save. Hearts pounding, the men watched Hartman prepare his forbidden experiment, haunted by memories and the promise of a miracle. The fate of 800 men hung on one strand of enemy wire, an old violin lesson, and a stubborn refusal to believe in impossible. The sun barely rose in Hürtgen forest. Frost clung to every surface, rendering flesh and steel equally numb. Billy Hartman stared at his crude assembly, the forbidden German wire stretched into a trembling loop, its length calculated from memory and guesswork more than textbook precision. Failure hung everywhere. In the biting wind, the engineer's contempt, the knowledge that every hour lost might mean another dozen men gone forever. Corporal Chin kept watch, rifle across his lap, eyes darting between Billy's frantic hands and the snow-draped woods. You sure you want to risk it? He muttered, half accusation, half encouragement. Hartman nodded, not bothering to answer. Sometimes hope was all you had left. Billy's mind spun through radio physics and violin nostalgia. The loop antenna needed harmony, resonance, the fragile music his grandfather once coaxed out of broken strings. Improvisation was survival. He wound copper coils, adjusted tension, used what little proper antenna wire still remained, praying that his father's faith in problem solvers would travel, somehow, across time and war. I need you to hold the frame steady, Billy whispered. Chin did, teeth chattering, gloved fingers clumsy. The snow fell heavier, muffling sound, denying the world outside its usual chaos. Nearby, the shifting crunch of boots meant German patrols closing the circle. Tension built, not just in the wire, but in every word in motion. Billy rehearsed conversations with himself, each one a negotiation. Too much inductance, the signal might never escape. Too little, energy lost instantly to the ghostly, hungry air. There was no manual for crisis, only instinct. Engineers, too, wrestled with order and chaos. Lieutenant Parker reappeared, glaring as Billy bent the rules further. You'll blow the transmitter, he scolded, and then what? Billy showed his notebook, pages of calculations, sketches from his youth, his grandfather's lessons. Parker's skepticism didn't budge, but something flickered behind his stare. Fear that the impossible might be required after all. Outside, sporadic German machine gun fire punctuated the silence. American units hunkered low in battered positions, old friends and strangers alike praying for luck, for rescue, for contact. In Alpha Company, Private Reynolds scribbled the last of his coordinates, hoping they'd reach someone before the next barrage. Bravo counted bodies, hoping this night at least would be quiet. Charlie, defending the ammo dump, made ready for defense with only half the artillery they could call upon. Dog Company watched the distant tree lean, believing they'd been forgotten. Inside the foxhole, Billy finished winding the last copper coil. Ready? Chin asked. Billy gave a grim smile. No one ever was. He pressed the microphone button. Static, then silence. Refusing despair, Billy adjusted the coil again, finer, tighter. He dialed frequencies, voice barely above whisper. Alpha, this is Baker 64. Radio check. Static again, then a flicker on the signal meter, a heartbeat. Faint, broken syllables. Baker, weak, repeat. It was enough. Enough to risk everything. A surge of hope ran down Billy's spine. He replied, the signal blurring through the storm of interference. Alpha, this is Baker 64. Confirm you read me. A strained voice answered, patchy but real. Alpha, affirmative, barely, signal, viable. Chin clapped Billy on the shoulder, relief flooding into the cramped, freezing space. Billy didn't celebrate, he pushed farther. Switching to Bravo Company's frequency, he sent the message again. Bravo, Baker 64. Radio check. This time, a stronger response. Baker 64, Bravo reads you strength 4. Where the hell have you been? The net began to come alive. Messages passed like breath between drowning men. Warnings of German movement, requests for artillery, pleas for evacuation, plans for defense. Billy's wild antenna, made from enemy wire and violin theory, reconnected the spine of a broken battalion. For half an hour, hope flowed through handmade circuits. Then the wind shifted and distant voices shouted, in German, now closer. Artillery thundered in reply as Charlie Company called for fire. Billy relayed coordinates. Battalion command confirmed. The forest, silent and blind for hours, suddenly came alive with life or death consequences. Every word mattered. Every transmission threaded through that fragile wire, each one a gamble. Would the coil hold? Would the resonance carry? Would ingenuity triumph over doctrine and disaster? Billy, face frozen, watched the meter hold steady. In that moment he realized what grandfather Joseph had always known. Sometimes, in the heart of crisis, disaster calls forth invention. And one act of impossible hope can tie together 100 separated souls, making them one again. The world outside Billy's foxhole became a battlefield chorus. Machines and men pushing against the silence as survival teetered in the balance. Charlie Company's urgent plea for artillery support echoed through the radio's warped speaker. We've got Germans 50 yards, need fire now. Billy gripped the microphone, his gaze flicking to Chin, who watched the snowy approach with dread. Battalion command's voice cut in, tense and clear. Coordinates received, stand by for fire mission. Time slowed, heartbeats measured by the erratic pulse of the signal meter. Billy's makeshift antenna, enemy wire bent to American need, tuned like a violin string, held the entire battalion together as the storm broke. The German assault came hard and fast. Shadows in the bone-white forest surged forward, rifles flashing, grenades flung. Alpha Company relayed movement on their flank, Bravo reported wounded in danger, Charlie braced for hand-to-hand defense. Dog's position, too exposed, was nearly cut off. The Americans could see the enemy coming. A gift bought by Hartman's violation of protocol, risk, faith. Billy worked the frequencies, adrenaline driving every adjustment. The radio's fragile components threatened collapse under unorthodox transmission. The copper coil, twisted for resonance, felt like a lifeline, and a fuse. Alpha, Bravo, Charlie, Dog, hold net. Hold line. Battalion, fire mission incoming. Billy barked, voice crackling, desperate to keep the signal alive. Artillery thundered, shaking the frozen earth. Preset coordinates allowed American guns to rain devastation with deadly timing. German squads, expecting to find isolated prey, met fierce resistance. Machine guns opening up, mortars dropping with clinical precision, squads suddenly coordinating as if some invisible thread had bound them all. That thread was Billy's wire, vibrating beneath ice and fear. Minutes bled away in freezes and flashes. Charlie Company's observer updated fire missions. Billy relayed them without pause. Bravo called for medics, 3 down needing evac. Alpha warned, infantry massing South Ridge. Each message passed through Hartman's circuit, each transmission a prayer, each adjustment risking overload, a catastrophic loss of every voice. As the German attack reached its zenith, Billy felt the limits. The signal wavered, static rising, copper coil trembling under the demands. Chin watched Billy urgently tune the coil, hands chafed and raw, breath icing in the bitter air. Morrison, the battalion commander, checked the radio, disbelief giving way to awe as the impossible antenna performed beyond doctrine, beyond hope. Outside, the American companies fought as one. Artillery struck targets with precision unheard in forest combat, defenders shifted weapons with split-second timing, the wounded were pulled back for evacuation, and every isolated heartbeat in the woods could now hear, could now call, could now fight. The climax crested at 1,500 hours. German rifles barked, but the Americans poured coordinated firepower onto assault squads. Radios relayed reports of movement, positions, and requests for munitions. Dog Company, cut off most of the morning, came back on the net, barely audible but alive. Billy's world contracted to the buzz of the signal meter and the warmth of Chen's hand on his shoulder, grounding him in the moment. The sound of battle, shouts, gunfire, the guttural cough of mortars, filtered into the foxhole. Hartman's improvised feat was no longer silent ingenuity, it had become the fulcrum between life and defeat. In the chaos, Morrison barked orders, relaying across the newly unified network. Engineers monitored equipment nervously, hoping Hartman's gamble would hold. Parker, the doubting lieutenant, hovered. His skepticism replaced now by curiosity, even admiration. Finally, 40 minutes after the first transmission, the attack faltered. German squads broke off, casualties mounting, morale shattered by invisible coordination. American defenders, their unity restored by forbidden wire and desperate hope, had repulsed the assault against impossible odds. The radio circuit, battered but functioning, had turned a rout into a defense, a miracle by any soldier's measure. Billy leaned back, exhaustion coursing through every muscle. The signal meter blinked, steady, true. He had built a weapon from wire and memory, saved men he'd never meet, violated every regulation out of necessity. Heart beating, he wondered if his grandfather, somewhere beyond, would have understood. Chin exhaled a long, shuddering breath. You did it? Against every rule, against every doubt. Billy's eyes never left the wire, now alive under the weight of history. The crisis had passed for now. But the lesson lingered, curling through the cold air. When manuals fail, memory and courage can be the tools that save us. When silence finally settled over Hürtgen Forest, it was the silence of survivors, not defeat. Billy Hartman slumped in his foxhole, exhaustion overtaking adrenaline. His hands, stained from copper and blood, rested atop the receiver. The makeshift antenna, German wire, American hope, and the memory of a violin, still stretched above like a rough halo. The radio net stayed open for 48 more hours, passing 100 messages, 3 coordinated artillery missions and urgent calls for rescue. Through static and storm, Hartman's invention kept words flowing, binding men who might otherwise have died alone in the snow. Battalion command arrived with new equipment and weary relief. The engineers who'd once scoffed at Billy's method now measured, sketched, asked questions about the crude coils and the stretched wire. Lieutenant Parker confiscated Billy's notebook, marked Field Modification, Needs Review. Official channels shrouded Hartman's solution. What didn't fit doctrine was quietly stashed in Army records as experimental. Captain Morrison wrote his after-action report with professional detachment. Field expedient antenna enabled re-establishment of communications under extreme conditions. He recommended Billy for commendation, a rare act of recognition. But division headquarters denied the request. To acknowledge Hartman's success would require admitting that established systems had failed and that a sergeant had outsmarted the manual. Billy's story did not end in glory. No medal would mention forbidden wire, or the frostbitten hours spent breaking every rule to save the battalion. Instead, word spread quietly. Signal Corps radio men, hearing fragments of the legend, began tinkering with salvaged wire, desperate for connection when no supplies could reach them. No book called it the Hartman method, but sometimes, when radios went dead and hope with them, men remembered that one story, that one solution never printed in a manual. The war ground on for months. Victory came not with parades, but with bitter quiet over too many battlefields. In September 1945, Billy returned home, a bronze star on his chest for unrelated bravery, not for the wire, not for Hürtgen forest. He walked through Kearney, Nebraska, his steps measured and slow, memory heavy. His father's hardware store struggled, shelves bare after years of war rationing. His mother's piano waited, quietly out of tune. The violin workshop, now silent, held the ghosts of a life before war, before wire, before rule-breaking became survival. Joseph Hartman's tools were still hanging on the walls, untouched since his death. Billy stood in the quiet, running his fingers along a block of maple, remembering the words, "When you cannot buy solution, you build solution." He did not reopen the shop. Instead, Billy took work at the telephone company, hiding in technical routine, fixing connections where nobody asked about combat, radios, or forbidden wires. His coworkers knew about the war, everyone did. But they never asked and he never told. What needed fixing was fixed quietly. Years later, a military historian sought Hartman for an interview. Classified reports had mentioned improvisation in Hürtgen forest, a story almost lost among thousands of forgotten innovations. Billy refused the interview. "It wasn't mine," he insisted. "It was my grandfather's and he's gone." When the historian's book was published, Billy's contribution was reduced to a single line: "Necessity proved the most effective engineering teacher." In 1998, Billy Hartman died in his hometown, aged 76. His obituary mentioned the Bronze Star, his career with the phone company, volunteer teaching in electronics. Never the antenna, never the day he saved 800 men with wire and a memory of music. Yet in a filing cabinet, deep in the Army Signal Corps Museum in Georgia, Billy's legacy remains. A water-stained notebook, a length of German wire, a photograph of a coil loop antenna lashed to wooden slats. No name. No explanation. Just proof that the impossible sometimes yields when someone refuses to accept the rules. That is the story of Billy Hartman, the sergeant who bent the world with his hands, who found hope in forbidden wire and courage in memories of music. History rarely remembers its hidden heroes. Their victories are stashed in silent archives, waiting for discovery. But for the men in Hürtgen forest, unity returned by a trembling wire and a memory, Billy's gamble was the difference between death and survival. Sometimes, as the snow settles and silence falls, the greatest victories belong to those who refuse to quit.